Kedren, you know that I like football, right?
Yes, I do.
And you know how much I like the coach for the Eagles, Doug
Yes.
Pederson.
Yes, I know how much you like him.
So I just think he's an amazing coach. We've talked about this before. The former Eagles coach was fired, and one of the reasons wasn't just a losing season, but because he had low emotional intelligence. And then the Eagles hired Doug Pederson, and this guy is such an example for our topic today, which is coaching.
That's perfect. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. For Doug Pederson, there's this obvious outcome of, I love to think about this, in 2017, and Adam, our podcaster here, he and I remember this.
Fly, Eagles,
yeah,
fly.
The Eagles won the Super Bowl. And it was so exciting. But also, last year they got into the playoffs. This year, they had a ton of injuries. They had like third stringers. They still made it to the playoffs. It was pretty amazing. And, of course, a lot of that has to do with these amazing athletes. But we have to give Doug Pederson credit for not just being smart, but for being the kind of coach who knows how to empower his team, how to make them really feel like they can accomplish difficult things, but also to be kind and respectful and create an environment where the team supports and drives one another to greatness. I really, really admire him for what he does.
I think so many of us do.
Welcome to The Behaviorist with Work Wisdom, where we help you adopt high-performance mindsets, behaviors, communication, and culture. I'm your host, Sarah Colantonio. Our intention for the Behaviorist podcast is to share accessible, concrete practices you can weave into your whole life to begin a shift toward joy and meaningful achievement. Today, we have my favorite person ever, Kedren Crosby, on the podcast. Thank you for joining me today,
Always a pleasure.
So we're talking about coaching 101. There's a lot we could talk about, but we want to kind of get to the basics of it. And one of the reasons we're talking about this is because so much of the work we do is in leadership development and executive coaching, really helping our clients be the best leaders they can be. And not only that, so, that external coaching that we do, but we do it internally with each other. And I'll never forget, early on, I was really nervous about a session I had coming up, and you coached me through it. You coached me about how to be a coach, and it was such a revelation, this way of coaching that's, how would you describe it?
Well, I think it's helpful to think about external coaching versus internal coaching. And we can talk about external coaching. Most of what we do, about half of what Work Wisdom does is external coaching, meaning that we work with companies all over the country, all over the world, and we are their external executive coaches. So we are helping them grow in self-awareness, helping to create a curriculum for them on which skills they need to grow in order to become the best versions of themselves, and then helping to embed those skills. So we do that externally, but there's also internal coaching, and that's becoming more and more popular. So we've actually trained internal coaches within other companies to become extraordinary internal coaches. There are benefits of having an external coach and benefits of having an internal coach. External coaches can maybe have some more crucial conversations, help staff grow in self-awareness in ways that might be a little awkward or uncomfortable for an internal coach. But we use a lot of the same philosophy and methodology with our external coaching as we do with our internal coaching. So we have five coaches on the team at Work Wisdom. And one of the things that I think is really unusual about Work Wisdom is that we coach each other.
Yeah.
So it sounds bizarre, but our managing partner, Jamie Arroyo, is actually my high performance habits coach. Kimberly Pfeiffer is actually my contemplative leadership coach. You coach me on a informal basis all the time. Kate definitely gets a chance to do some coaching with me on well-being, stress, and resilience. So I think that's one of the more unusual aspects of being part of Work Wisdom, is that we can really rely on each other.
Yeah, it's definitely a gift. One of the ways that we define coaching is it's a leader who coaches effectively, is seen as a mentor who supports employee growth. Employees are nurtured towards achieving their highest levels of performance. That sounds really Work Wisdom-y. And I like that definition. It sounds promising to me, but I wonder if listeners, maybe they think, but what does it really mean concretely?
When I'm explaining this or presenting this concept, it can help people to frame it as what is a manager versus what is a leader, because managers tend to use supervision as a technique for accomplishing their goals, whereas leaders tend to use coaching as a technique for accomplishing their goals. So sometimes, even when I'm trying to define what coaching is, I back it up a little bit and start thinking about, okay, well, what's a manager versus what's a leader, and start thinking through. Well, Peter Drucker says managers are people who do things right versus leaders who are people who do the right things. I don't like to pit them against each other. I'm sure Peter Drucker didn't mean it in any kind of pejorative way against managers, but in any given day, some of us are both managers and leaders. And I think the real skill is knowing, when do I use my manager techniques versus when do I use my leader techniques, like coaching. So when we think about managers, we're really thinking managers are really focused more on efficiency, really trying to think about the means, the process. They're the builders of systems, operationalizing visions, whereas leaders are really the architects. They are visioning. Most of their work is around, how do I inspire and motivate others to dig deeper, be more creative, so that we can collectively achieve this vision. So maybe I'm going in a direction that's a little bit too deep, but I think that it's important to understand that those are the two styles of how do we help others grow, and one is not better than the other. It's just they're different.
When do you need to? Yeah. And not to bring up Doug Pederson again, just for a moment though.
Yes,
but
let's talk about him.
I mean, I can imagine that there's both styles are so important. I think he gets a lot of accolades for how he's a leader, but he has to manage. I mean, he has to do the basic stuff that you have to do to call plays and figure out strategies and hire players and all those things that are logistical and necessary. And but also a big part of his job is inspiring and motivating. He in one of his interviews was talking about how organized he is. That's a logistical thing. He keeps everything in order, but also the way he motivates his team to win this game and to work as hard as they possibly can. And he talks a lot about being present and inspiring those athletes to stay present, because there's so many instances where you falter, and to remember, okay, next play, like I'm just going to be present for that. So again, I think he does a nice job of balancing those two things, because you're right. They both are really necessary. They don't need to be pitted, but the balance is how amazing, right?
And we can start shifting in a direction towards more coaching. So when I think about, the proportion of my day that I'm supervising versus the proportion of my day that I'm coaching, we are in a space and in a time at Work Wisdom where, because of growth, we're really shifting my role more towards coaching. So when we think about what what is it that supervisors do? What are the techniques of supervisors? The communication tends to be more directive, one directional, saying, okay, Sarah, I need you to do this thing. Fill out this piece of paper this way, deliver this presentation this way. My job as a supervisor is really based on evaluation. I'm trying to judge, are you doing this well or not so well, and how can I get you to do it better? So it's based on evaluation. It's really about efficiency. My perspective is a shorter time horizon as a supervisor. I tend to be more process oriented, but in my role where I'm growing into coaching more, I'm trying to be more bi-directional in how I communicate. I'm trying to do a lot more listening than telling. I'm helping others arrive at solutions using inquiry, helping them establish the criteria that they need so that they can be critical decision makers on their own, so they can make great decisions, maybe without me someday. So it's all about, really taking the long view, focusing on how do we grow? How do we scale? How do we scale not just profit? How do we scale impact? Of course, here it's all about the revolution. How do we revolutionize achievement and build that engagement? So it's particularly pertinent since our big question this year is about empowerment.
Yeah. So that brings me to my next question. There's a book on the table in front of you called Helping People Change. And I want to ask you about why you brought that here today. What's going on with that book?
Well, I feel like we can't talk about coaching without talking about this very important new book. Richard Boyatzis has been someone that I've looked up to for maybe decades now. He's always been out there talking about coaching, maybe even before we called coaching. And he also talks quite a bit about the kind of leadership, resonant leadership that we really aspire to help our coaches, our leaders really lean into. And this new book that he wrote on helping people change is just gold. It is. Okay. You might call it a book sitting in the middle of the table. It's a big nugget of gold. And so, in fact, for our continuing ed this month, for our coaches here at Work Wisdom, we talked about this new book and what we can glean from it. So that we can use it internally and maybe even sometimes share it with our clients. So Boyatzis is the father of intentional change theory, and I think it was in the 70s. Maybe he's not that old, but I think it was in the 70s when he started writing about intentional change theory. So it's brilliant and simple. Basically, it has 5 stages. If you want to help people change, you have to help them through these 5 different stages. And it's so work wisdom. So the first is that you have to help them really vision their ideal state. Who are they? We use positive guided visualization to help people see themselves 5 years out, sometimes 10 years out, maybe only 1 year out for some people. But once they can start seeing who they are at that place, you take them to the second part of intentional change theory, which is where you start doing a little bit of non-judgmental comparison between the current state and the future state. So who are we in this new version of ourselves versus who are we today? And what are the habits? What are the behaviors? What are the mindsets that we need to develop so that we become this new future, better version of ourselves? So that's that second part, is doing that non-judgmental comparison. The third part is, Boyatzis calls it a learning agenda. We call it our curriculum. So when we take a client to this future state, do that comparison, then we say, okay, what skills, behaviors, mindsets, habits are you going to need to drop into your toolbox so that you can become this version of yourself? And then we actually make it a curriculum for them, and then we help them develop those skills. So that's the third part. The fourth part is experimenting with those new behaviors in a safe way. We tend to start with baby steps and then help them feel emboldened by the success they have with those new behaviors. And then the fifth part is really helping them form relationships, colleagues, friendships that will allow them to continue experimenting with these improved behaviors and reinforcing as well. So that's intentional change theory. So we love it. We maybe do it in a slightly different order at Work Wisdom, but it's Boyatzis. He's the king.
He's the king.
He's the king.
That's the gold.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe we get him on the podcast one day.
Okay. All right. That sounds good. I like this last step, trusting relationships where individuals can continue to grow. It makes me think about vulnerability, being in a workplace where you have the ability to make mistakes. We talk about psychological safety so often. I think that even our discussion maybe shifts the perspective of coaching in some ways. When I keep going back to Doug Pederson, but sports coaching, there's a lot of famous coaches who really rail on the players, and they're kind of famous for doing that, and they might even have winning records and things like that. But one of the things that we've talked about, not on the podcast, but this notion of coaching with compassion versus compliance. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. What are the key parts of that make that better than somebody who might create winners, but it's more about
short-term versus long-term. Yeah. So there are lots of disciplines that come at this in a variety of ways, and we could have all of our 5 coaches come on and we can all talk about our influences that taught us essentially to put love or empathy or compassion or understanding or deep listening or whatever we call it in the room into that person's life so that they can begin to open up, become more creative, become more open to trying new behaviors. So Boyatzis happens to call it compassion, compassion, coaching with compassion as opposed to coaching for compliance. So when you think about coaching for compliance, it's sort of carrot versus stick. It's punitive. Compliance is, if you don't do this thing, I will punish you. So when you think about a lot of the world of human resources, there's something called a performance improvement plan that's tends to be coaching for compliance. So it's basically saying, if you don't change this behavior, we're going to, punish you, dock your pay, fire you, whatever it is. Not necessarily coming at that individual from a place of compassion, which is trying to listen, trying to understand, trying to help them visualize their aspired self, dream of the behaviors that will help them become this aspired, more high-performing self. So, the thing is, it's very related to PEA and NEA. So without going too deep into this, PEA is positive emotional attractors and NEA is negative emotional attractors. So PEA is when we are feeling positive and open, we're feeling hopeful, we're feeling that we can vision the future, and it comes from a place of compassion. So when someone treats us with compassion and listens to us and helps us think about what's great and what we can make even more great, that opens us up. And so we can do a lot more successful growing when we are in the PEA rather than the NEA, which is the negative emotional attractors. So when someone's sort of shoulding on us and telling us, how we're bad and how we stink at something, and if we don't do it right the next time, we're going to get fired, we're far more likely to shut down, and really it becomes manifest that we do stink at it. Even if we didn't stink terribly at it, it will just sort of become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yeah. So the NEA is helpful in that a lot of sustained desired change starts in the NEA. We feel like garbage.
Right.
And so we decide, you know what, it's just time. Yeah. I'm just going to stop, smoking or whatever, lose 15 pounds or get a better job or get out of this marriage or whatever that is. It has to come from the NEA, but to have the permanent, lasting, flourishing, you need to go to the PEA. So there's a variety of, you can think about how much time should I spend in the PEA versus the NEA when I'm coaching this client. At Work Wisdom, we tend to think about John Gottman's work. He was a marriage psychologist, but this idea around you kind of want to have the 5 positives for every 1 negative to kind of balance it out, because we hear the negative at such a loud volume and it's so sticky. So anyhow, I hope that answered your question. That was maybe a little bit more than you needed there.
No, that's okay. That's great.
We can edit.
Yeah, that's right. I was thinking, so when I used to teach public speaking, I think that's public speaking can be really hard to do, especially for those students. But I would always, if I had a correction, like a behavior that needed to be corrected, I would look so hard and closely for the behaviors that worked, and so I could make sure that I was presenting those to kind of outweigh the negative ones that would be hard to handle.
Yeah, it is important, the NEA, but it's necessary. But I think it's in smaller doses. Yeah.
I want to close with a final question, which is about the coaching questions, because something that you've talked about in the past is the fact that we're not talking about telling people how to be necessarily. It's really uncovering that person's own wisdom and their own abilities. Yeah. And so a lot of what we do with coaching, and I think this is something that you taught me early on, is that I don't have to tell people, like I don't have to teach them information, but I need to learn how to listen and ask the right questions, which I feel like you do with such skill. So I wanted to close with just a question about what are some of the key coaching questions you'd be willing to share with the listeners? Like, what are some coaching questions that you think sort of open up other people's minds?
Yeah. Before I talk about that, I just want to shine the light on something that you just spoke about, which I think is a fundamental difference in how we do coaching at Work Wisdom, which is this belief that the answer lies within the person, and that it's really our job just to clear away the murkiness and clear away whatever that obstacle is that's not allowing them to be that best version of themselves. So other coaches don't have that philosophy. They believe that they have to help this person become a different version of themselves. So the types of questions that we ask tend to help people go back to a time when they were exceptional. So if, let's say you're in some dilly of a pickle at work right now, and I'm trying to help you recognize that you do have everything you need in order to be skillful at this. I'll be asking you questions about, tell me a time when you had to manage a conflict and you did it really well. And so I might even be asking you to think of your whole life. And so maybe you'll tell me a time when, Paul and Christina were fighting, and as the older sister, you were able to, manage it and keep the family together, and you did a beautiful job. And then I'll be saying questions like, how can you cut and paste that experience when you did such a great job onto this situation here at work? We have a set of coaching questions that we use internally. One of my favorites is one that my old friend Charlie Crystal, I don't think he lives in Lancaster anymore, but he always used to say, what's the goal here? And it was beautiful because it just crystallized everything that came after that. So I think, people can get in touch with us if they want to know more about, the types of questions that we use. But it's an elegant way of getting the other person to either discover that they already have it within themselves, and then also think about how did I do it in the past and how can I cut and paste that onto the future.
I love that.
Yeah, it works well.
Yeah. So thank you, Kedron, for your wisdom about coaching in this Coaching 101 episode. Thank you, listeners, for downloading The Behaviorist, and we hope you'll subscribe. Please reach out to us through our website, workwisdomllc.com. You can enjoy Work Wisdom Press and productions, ask questions, and give suggestions for topics you'd like us to explore in future episodes. As is our custom, we'll leave you with a quote, this time from Coach Doug Pederson of the Eagles. When asked how he feels about how players want to play for him, how they want to play on the Eagles team and play in the city of Philadelphia, he said, "It means the world to me because it means that they've bought into what I've been teaching. We've built a culture where it's exciting to come to work every single day. It's an atmosphere that's conducive for learning and to be successful."